I had always wanted to live in a small town. After years surrounded by the endless noise and insane rush of the big cities, all I wanted was a place where I could hear the sound of the wind and wake up to the smell of wet grass. When I found that little two-story house on a nearly forgotten street in a tiny town in Vermont, I thought I had finally found my piece of peace. The move was smooth. There wasn't much to bring, just a few boxes, simple furniture, and a heart eager for a fresh start. The street was quiet, lined with ancient trees that seemed to whisper among themselves, and most of the houses around were empty, with "for sale" or "for rent" signs hanging dusty yards. However, it was on the very first night that something disturbed me. While unpacking some boxes in the living room, I felt that strange sensation, that primal instinct that screams when you're being watched. I looked out the window facing the house next door, an old wooden building with dark walls and opaque glass panes. That's when I saw it. On the second floor, at the far left window, there was a silhouette. It was just a shape, motionless, hard to distinguish from a distance. But it was there, without a doubt, watching me. I stood frozen for a few seconds, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was a torn curtain, maybe just an illusion created by the moonlight. I decided to ignore it and continued unpacking. But every time I passed by the window, I felt the weight of that gaze. It wasn't just discomfort, it was as if something was trying to break through the thin layer of normalcy I was desperately clinging to. Before bed, I closed all the curtains in the house. And even then, under the covers, in the darkness of my bedroom, I knew there was someone behind that window. Someone who never looked away. Someone who, somehow, already seemed to know everything about me. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that it was just nerves caused by the move. New houses always bring unfamiliar noises, unexpected shadows. But it wasn't the house that unsettled me, it was the house next door. The silhouette remained there. Sometimes I could swear it shifted position. Some nights I saw it closer to the window. Other times a little farther back, but always present. It was like an old painting, almost motionless, yet alive enough to make my stomach churn. I started observing too. Every morning before leaving for work, I would steal a quick glance at that window, always there. When I returned at night, the same figure, now just a dark stain against the dim moonlight. It didn't matter the time. Midnight, noon, late afternoon, that presence seemed to have no rest, no purpose beyond watching. It didn't take long for it to start affecting my routine. I began avoiding opening the curtains during the day and kept the lights on at night, as if that could create a barrier between me and whatever lurked outside. Sleep became rare. I tossed and turned in bed, alert to every sound, every movement from the other side. My coworkers began to notice how exhausted I looked. I joked once that I thought my neighbor was a bit intense. They just laughed, saying that small towns often had nosy neighbors, but that they were harmless. But something deep inside me knew it wasn't mere curiosity that was watching me. It was something different. Something deeper and older, as if the act of being watched was only the first step toward something much bigger. Something I couldn't yet comprehend. And even knowing that, a part of me, the part desperately clinging to normality, kept insisting, maybe tomorrow he won't be there. But he always was. Always. The constant presence was already disturbing enough. But it was when the small things began happening that true fear set in. At first, they were easy details to ignore. A picture frame out of place, a window I was sure I had closed now slightly ajar. Things that could be blamed on distraction or the wind. But as the days went by, the incidents became harder to explain. One night, when I arrived home, I found the back door unlocked. I clearly remembered checking all the locks before leaving. The air inside the house felt colder than usual, as if an invisible presence had slipped inside, leaving only its chilling trace behind. On another occasion, I found faint footprints on the living room carpet. Barefoot footprints, small like those of a child, but the house was empty. I had no children. I received no visitors. Each new incident eroded my sanity a little more. I began to question whether I was truly safe, or if somehow the gaze from across the street was only the prelude to something worse. I started locking and reinforcing the doors with furniture at night. I barricaded the entrances as if preparing for an invasion. Even so, the marks, the signs, kept appearing, defying any logical explanation. One early morning, I woke up to the faint creaking sound coming from the kitchen. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath, listening to the pounding of my own heart. When I finally gathered the courage to go downstairs, I found all the drawers wide open, as if someone had rummaged through every corner searching for something. Instinctively, I looked out the kitchen window. He was there, the same motionless figure outlined by the pale moonlight, watching, waiting. It reached a point where fear, as suffocating as it was, gave way to a desperate need to understand what was happening. I needed answers, whatever the cost. I started with simple questions, discreetly asked to the few townspeople I came across. When I mentioned the house next door, the reactions varied between discomfort and a heavy silence that resembled superstition. Best to leave it alone, some said. Others just looked away, as if my interest was a mistake they preferred not to share. Not satisfied, I went to the town's small registry office. I dug through property records, resident histories. That's when the truth began to surface. The house next door had been abandoned for over 12 years. The last registered resident was a solitary old man named Thomas Whitmore, a name no one seemed willing to talk about. According to the records, Thomas had mysteriously disappeared. No farewell letter, no clues. He simply vanished, and the house had been sealed by the town hall ever since. There were no rental permits, no sales recorded. In theory, that house should be empty. And yet, every night, someone watched me from that window. It was then that I realized something even more disturbing. No one, in the entire town, lived in the nearby houses. Most had moved away over the past few years, citing reasons that ranged from bad feelings to things they couldn't explain. The entire street seemed to have been abandoned in haste, as if everyone knew something that I naively ignored. With that information boiling in my mind, I returned home that night certain that I had made a mistake moving there. I locked every door and window more tightly than ever, but deep down I knew the threat wasn't outside. It was already lurking. It always had been. When I peeked one last time through the curtain, there he was, unshakable, unsettling, as if waiting for the right moment to cross the thin barrier between our houses and between our realities. That night, I decided I could no longer live under the shadow of that gaze. If there was something in the house next door, something of flesh, spirit, or madness, I needed to confront it, or I would never have peace. The rain began to pour heavily, as if the very sky were trying to stop me. But the decision was made. I threw on a coat, grabbed a flashlight, and ignoring every instinct screaming for me to stay, crossed the street. The fence was broken in several places, and the wooden gate creaked out a grim protest as I pushed it open. The tall grass brushed against my legs as I approached the house. No lights, no sound beyond the rain drumming on the rooftops. The front door yielded disturbingly easily, opening into a hallway steeped in mold and darkness. The air reeked of abandonment and something more metallic rust, or perhaps dried blood. Each step echoed like a scream across the rotting wood. I felt invisible eyes following me as I searched through the empty rooms, finding only dusty furniture and absent memories. There were no signs of recent life, no footprints but my own. I climbed the creaking stairs to the second floor, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. I knew exactly which window to look for, the one where the silhouette always appeared. I reached the room. It was empty. Nothing but a chair pushed against the window and deep marks in the floor, as if someone had spent countless hours there, motionless, watching. I approached and on impulse looked through the glass, and that's when I saw it. Across the street, In the window of my house, a figure stood, watching. But this time, it was me who was on the wrong side of the window. I felt the floor tilt beneath my feet. How was that possible? I was alone, or at least I thought I was. I stumbled back, rushed down the stairs, nearly falling in my panic. The street seemed darker now, longer, stretching as if to prevent me from reaching home. I burst through my front door, slamming it shut behind me. The house was silent. I raced upstairs to my bedroom, and it was empty. No figure at the window. No sign of invasion. But then I noticed, placed carefully on my bed was something. A photograph. In the image, a child me, at 6 years old, playing in a park I barely remembered. And in the background, standing at a distance, a blurred man watching. It was the same outline. The same motionless stance. He had always been there. The truth hit me like a crushing weight. I was never chosen by chance. I had been followed, watched since childhood. And now, finally, he was closer than ever. I had never liked old apartments, but necessity forced me to accept that one. The building was in a quiet neighborhood in Pennsylvania, with large windows, wide hallways, and an air that time had forgotten its inhabitants. It was exactly what I could afford. The move was quick. In just a few hours, my boxes were stacked inside the small studio on the 3rd floor. The building seemed almost empty. Some neighbors bumped into me on the stairs, gave discreet nods, but few exchanged words. A heavy silence hovered through the hallways, as if the walls kept more than just old echoes. On the first night, while I was organizing my things, I felt something different. A sweet, sickening smell filled the air. It wasn't ordinary perfume. It was dense, almost sticky, as if it clung to everything it touched. I went to the door, curious. The hallway was deserted. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, casting shadows that danced on the walls. And then I realized the smell was coming from the door to my left. An apartment that, as far as I knew, never showed any signs of movement. No lights on, no voices. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to make sense of it. The door looked normal, old and peeling like the others. But there was something disturbingly alluring about that scent. Something that pulled at me, forcing me to stay there longer than I should have. I ended up going back inside, trying to ignore it. Maybe a new neighbor, I thought. Someone who went overboard with perfume. But deep down, I knew that smell wasn't normal. It felt more ancient. As if it had been released from somewhere it was supposed to stay forgotten. That night, even lying in bed with all the windows closed, I could still smell that sweet scent hanging around my bed. And I fell asleep with the unsettling feeling that soon it wouldn't just bring a smell. The following nights brought the same perfume. Always at the same time, between 2 and 3 in the morning, when the world seemed most vulnerable. It was as if the scent marked the beginning of something, a silent ritual that only I seemed to notice. The aroma grew stronger each night. First, just a sweet breeze in the hallway. Then, a suffocating wave that invaded my apartment, impregnating my furniture, my clothes, my very skin. It didn't matter what I did, locking doors, sealing windows, stuffing towels into cracks, the perfume always found a way in. But the smell didn't come alone. On some nights, I would hear it. Subtle sounds. Scratches on the walls, soft footsteps approaching my door, and stopping just inches away from where I curled up on the other side. Once, I was sure I heard my doorknob slowly turning, as if someone were testing if it was truly locked. During the day, everything seemed normal. No trace of the perfume, no suspicious noises. Only the dense, resigned silence of the residents, who seemed to pretend that nothing strange was happening there. I started to wonder if the problem was me. Maybe it was exhaustion, stress. Maybe my brain was creating all of it. But every time the early hours arrived and the sweet scent began to spread like an invisible mist, I knew it was real, and it was getting closer. It wasn't just a perfume. It was a warning. A presence that, night after night, shortened the distance between us. By then, I could no longer ignore what was happening. The smell, the sounds, everything seemed to grow more insistent each night. I needed answers. I started discreetly, trying to strike up conversations with the few neighbors I encountered in the hallways or the shared laundry room. But the moment I mentioned the apartment next door, expressions would change. Smiles would vanish. Eyes would look away. An elderly woman with gray hair, who lived on the first floor, only shook her head forcefully when I asked about the resident of 3B. "Leave it alone," she whispered, before hurrying off, as if just speaking about it might bring consequences. Another time, when I casually mentioned it to the janitor, quiet man with a stern face, he simply replied with a dry sentence, "That door should stay closed." Then he resumed his work, ignoring any further attempts at conversation. The answers or the lack of them were even scarier than the silence. I decided to watch for myself. Every night, I would position myself near the peephole of my door, trying to catch any movement from the neighboring apartment. But I never saw anyone entering, never saw anyone leaving. Still, the perfume would appear, unwavering, like an invisible clock marking the start of something that was getting closer. I began to feel that the entire building was complicit, as if somehow everyone had accepted that presence, as if the building itself had made a silent pact. Don't disturb it, don't question it. But I had already gone too far. And something on the other side of that door knew I was trying to understand. It knew my curiosity was a rope being pulled. And soon it would snap. It was on an especially humid night that everything changed. The perfume appeared earlier, before midnight. It was no longer just a smell. It was a thick presence in the air, almost solid, forcing its way through the cracks of my door, clinging to my throat, my eyes, my memories. I tried to resist, but the scent was so strong that my body felt twice as heavy. Sleep dragged me toward a torpor I fought to escape. Feeling suffocated, I decided to go outside. Maybe the fresh air in the hallway would bring me back to consciousness. When I opened the door, the first thing I noticed was the darkness. Only a faint light flickering at the end of the corridor, like a candle about to go out. The second thing was the door to 3B slightly ajar. A strand of even more intense perfume escaped through the opening, as if calling me. A silent, irresistible, and at the same time, deadly invitation. My instincts screamed for me to go back, to lock my door and pretend I had never seen it. But my legs moved on their own. Each step I took toward 3B seemed to wrap my mind in denser fog. I stood in front of the door. Inside, there was total darkness. Not a sound, no sign of life. I took a deep breath, trying to gather courage to push the door and look inside. When I finally did, the perfume exploded in my mind like a forgotten memory, a scent of wilted flowers, sweet to the point of rotting, as if death itself had perfumed itself to welcome me. And then I saw it. In the middle of the empty room, under the faint light escaping from the street, a hunched figure, indistinct, motionless, seemed to be waiting for me. Or perhaps had always been there. Watching, calling, waiting for me to cross the line I should never have crossed. For a moment, I thought it was just an illusion, the effect of the suffocating smell and exhaustion. But when the hunched figure moved, slowly, like a piece of shadow peeling off the ground, I realized it was real. I tried to step back, but my feet felt glued to the floor. Every breath pulled more of that rotting aroma into my lungs, dulling my mind. My body no longer obeyed properly. And then, in that heavy mist, I understood. The perfume wasn't just a smell. It was a call. A trap built with patience, night after night, until my will was broken. It was an invitation to cross a boundary and a sentence for those who accepted it. The figure extended a thin, almost translucent arm, pointing inside the empty apartment. On the floor, I began to notice old stains, dark marks spreading like dead roots. stains that seemed to outline the shapes of bodies, many bodies. There were no tenants there. There were echoes. People who, like me, had followed the sweet scent to the end and never left. With a desperate effort, I took 2 steps back. I felt the resistance of the air, as if trying to swim against an invisible current. The figure didn't move. It only watched me, without a face, without a voice. In a final impulse, I slammed the door of 3B shut with a dry thud and ran back to my apartment, locking the door behind me with every turn of the key I could manage. That night, the perfume didn't come back, but it left something inside me. Something I feel every night when the world falls silent and the scent returns, not from outside. Now it's inside me, waiting for the next door to crack open. When I decided to move to that small town in rural Ohio, all I was looking for was peace. A quiet place where I could start over, far from the constant noise and distrust of big cities. The house I found was perfect, small, cozy, with a spacious backyard surrounded by an old wooden fence. The street was quiet, lined with rows of old houses, each hiding its little secrets behind closed curtains. In the first few days, I met some neighbors. Nice people, but reserved, as is common in small towns. Quick greetings on the sidewalk, brief conversations about the weather or the local market. However, one neighbor in particular didn't seem to take part in that small community. The resident of the house behind mine, which shared a direct boundary with my backyard. No one talked much about him. I never saw him coming or going. His house, an aged wooden structure with a dark roof, seemed permanently sunk in shadow, even under the bright midday sun. The grass in his yard grew unevenly, as if it refused to align with the quiet order of the rest of the neighborhood. During the day, it was easy to forget about that house. Life went on normally, with children playing in the street and neighbors trimming their fences. But as night fell, a strange feeling would take over the air. The neighbor's backyard seemed to absorb light. While the other houses lit up their porches and windows, that patch of land remained shrouded in oppressive darkness. It was as if the night there was denser, more alive. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe the exhaustion from the move, perhaps loneliness manifesting in irrational forms. But deep down, something told me that house held more than just empty walls, and that the neighbor who lived there might not be like the others. As the weeks passed, I began to watch my neighbor's backyard more carefully. It wasn't intentional at first, just a reflex, a furtive glance through the kitchen window while making dinner or a quick peek before bed. It was during those moments that I realized something was wrong. The backyard, though full of tall grass and weeds, seemed frozen. A kind of stillness that didn't match the lively and restless nature of the outside world. The surrounding trees swayed in the wind. Leaves flew down the street, but there, in that patch of land, nothing moved. The grass was never mowed. There was no sound of a lawnmower, no footsteps treading the soil. Even during summer storms, when the wind howled through the house cracks and tore branches from trees, his yard remained still, like a photograph printed in the middle of the night. The gate that separated our backyards, an old splintered wooden structure, never opened either. Even when strong storms toppled trash and shook neighboring fences, that gate stood firm, as if some invisible force kept it shut. It was impossible not to feel that something or someone was watching. I started noticing small details that reinforced this disturbing sensation. The absence of any light in the neighbor's house, even on the darkest nights. No movement at the windows. No shadows passing behind the curtains. It was as if time had stopped inside that house, as if it existed apart from the rest of the street. And even without concrete proof, a silent certainty began to root itself within me. That house was not empty, and whatever lived there did not want to be disturbed. The first time I saw the shadow, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. It was late at night. I was sitting in the living room, watching TV with the volume low, trying to unwind after a hard day. It was just a subtle movement, almost imperceptible, caught out of the corner of my eye. Something in the backyard, something beyond the back window. At first, I hesitated to look directly, but the sensation of being watched was so strong, so dense, that it felt like it was pressing against my skin. I slowly turned my head. There it was. A tall shadow, still, standing next to the fence that divided our yards. The silhouette was darker than the night itself. It had no defined contours, didn't seem to wear clothes, and no features could be distinguished. It was just a patch of concentrated darkness staring at my house. For a long moment, I stood there, frozen, watching. The shadow did not move. I hurriedly closed the curtains, my hands trembling, and tried to convince myself it was just imagination. Maybe a broken streetlight, maybe the reflection of a tree. But deep down, I knew. The next night, I didn't have to look for it. While turning off the kitchen lights, I saw it again, standing in the same spot. Always by the fence, always still, always facing me. And so it went, night after night. It didn't matter if it rained, if it was windy, if it was freezing. The shadow was there, silent, persistent, a silent vigil. I didn't know what it wanted, or why it now seemed more evident than ever. I just knew that, somehow, I had become the center of its attention. And with each passing day, that presence seemed a little closer. The constant fear turned into necessity. I needed to understand what was happening, needed to know who or what lived in the house behind mine. I started asking the neighbors subtly. A casual comment in the market line, a light question to the neighbor across the street while watering the garden. But every time I mentioned the house in the back, the reactions were almost identical. Closed faces, abrupt changes of subject, uncomfortable evasions. It was as if a silent rule hovered over the neighborhood. Don't talk about that house. Don't ask about what lives there. But not everyone could hide completely. One gray afternoon, while chatting with an elderly woman who lived on the corner, she let something slip, a small fragment of information that stuck in my mind like a splinter. There used to be children in that house. Lots of children. Until, well, best you stay away. I asked what she meant, but she just shook her head and walked away, as if regretting having said more than she should. That phrase echoed in my mind for days afterward. Children, lots of children. And now, only silence and the shadow. I decided to search the city's public records. One spent a few nights at the local library, digging through old newspapers and property records. There wasn't much information about the house in the back, but an old article caught my attention. Tragedy on Willow Street. The article, yellowed and poorly printed, reported that decades ago, a clandestine orphanage operated out of those adapted houses, including my neighbors. A fire mysteriously started in the middle of the night, killed almost all the children. Only the administrator survived. What no one could explain was how the fire seemed to spare the physical structure of the back house, as if somehow it had been preserved or protected. Reading that sent a chill down my spine. The shadow watching from the yard, the grass that never moved, the gate that never opened. Maybe what was out there wasn't just a strange neighbor. Maybe it was something that should no longer exist in this world. Something that, night after night, waited for an opportunity to cross the distance between us. That night, the wind began to blow stronger than I had ever seen since moving there. The trees bent under the storm's force, and the sound of the wind whistling through the house's cracks seemed like a warning, a silent scream telling me to stay inside, locked up, hidden. But something was different. The smell of wet earth mixed with a sweeter, sour scent that I couldn't identify. A smell of something ancient being forcibly unearthed. I went to the kitchen window, driven by an impulse I knew I shouldn't feed. That's when I saw it, the fence. The old wooden fence that separated my backyard from the neighbors was gone. Not fallen, not broken. Gone. In its place, only an empty space, a dark gap that seemed to absorb all the surrounding light. And across from it, standing at the edge of my yard, was him. The shadow, but now it was different. It was no longer just a still figure stuck behind the fence. It was something bigger, more defined, something that seemed to feed on the absence of the barrier that had contained it. I felt the weight of its gaze, a real physical weight, like invisible hands pressing against my chest. The shadow took a step forward, and even though its body made no sound, I swear I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet. The distance between us was just a few meters now. Instinctively, I closed the curtains and rushed to lock every door and window. I shoved furniture against the back door. The wind seemed to blow even harder, as if trying to tear the very structure of the house apart. All night long, I sat there on the kitchen floor, clutching a kitchen knife in my hands, knowing that if that thing wanted to enter, nothing would stop it. But it didn't enter. Not that night. When the sun finally rose, I found my backyard empty. No sign of the shadow, no sign of the fence. Only the open space, like an exposed wound between two realities. Days later, I had a new fence installed, taller and sturdier. But deep down, I knew it was useless. What was on the other side no longer needed permission to cross. And even now, as I write these words, I sometimes feel, in the dead of night, a weight in the air. The sound of light footsteps on the wet grass. A presence standing outside my window. Waiting. The shadow was never the neighbor. The shadow was always the backyard. And now, without barriers, it has found its way.